That was Mozart's airy An die Freundschaft, to friendship. Friendships also live from what remains unsaid within them. This is a quote from Isabelle Graw's book On the Benefits of Friendship, in which she ponders questions around friendship in a highly competitive culture and from an art world perspective. How should we address vulnerable questions within our friendships? What should be said and what should remain unsaid? In the art sphere, colleagues are often friends and friends are often colleagues. This is reflected in the title of this event series, which is Commune, a word that the Cambridge Dictionary defines as a group of families or single people who live together and work together, sharing possessions and responsibilities. Although not literally a commune, in this event series, UKS is exploring how we can open up the institution in this new building that we have to be molded into a meeting place for artistic, theoretical, and not least social encounters that can spur and maintain friendships. To do this, we are dependent on our broader local and international communities of practitioners and audiences to take part in this mission. And today we are very lucky to have the author of the book that I initially quoted with us for a conversation on just this, friendship in the art world. Isabelle Graw is a Berlin-based art critic, and she is professor of art history and art theory at the Stedel-Schule in Frankfurt. She is the co-founder and currently publisher of the magazine Texte zur Kunst, and has written extensively on painting theory and the art market throughout her career. Her book On the Benefits of Friendship was published in English last year and is written in the form of a fictional diary, marking a shift in Isabelle's work towards a more experimental form of writing. My name is Lieve Drønen, and I am the interim artistic director here at UKS, and will be in conversation with Isabelle for the next hour. There will be time for audience questions, so please, if you think of anything as we go along, note them down. For your information, this is being recorded and filmed and will be published on the UKS website later, so if you have any questions and would like to be omitted from the recording, you can just let me or Mariusz here know afterwards. So, first of all, a warm welcome to you, Isabelle, and thank you so much for traveling to Oslo.
Thank you for having me, Liv. Oh, Liv, I have to pronounce.
Lieve.
Liv.
Yeah.
Oh,
Lieve.
Liva. Liva.
That's good.
Beautiful.
Thank you. So I wanted to start with something that appears quite early on in this book that you've written. Because early on, the I character writes in one of her diary entries that by writing the book, she wants to give voice to what usually goes unspoken in friendship. And so I wanted to start by asking you two questions. And one is, who is this I? And why? And if you could say a bit about why you wanted to kind of map this unspoken landscape of friendship.
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Liv, for having me here. I'm very excited to be in a union kind of condition here, one of the few European artist unions. I'm very interested in that. Maybe we can speak about that more, because it's a rare thing, considering that unionization is in the retreat, at least in Germany. I'm very glad to be here in Oslo. I wasn't here for a long time, and I also want to say that, you know, when I wrote a book and then I reread it, it always sounds a bit as if someone else has written it. I can never quite believe that this is actually something I did. It's very alienating, and I tend to read my own books as if someone else wrote them. Just one little thing you said, that On the Benefits of Friendship is my turn to experimental writing. That's not quite right, because I wrote a book before, which is called In Another World. And that was actually my first attempt to write down those reflections on, first of all, the labor of mourning that I conducted faced with the death of both of my parents, and secondly, faced with paradigmatic shifts in the political and cultural landscape between 2014 and 2017, which is when Trump came to power, which is when Brexit happened, which is when Me Too started. And I felt that I needed a different language to capture these changes, both on the level of my own personal life, but also on the social, political, and cultural life, and started to write these miniatures in another world. And that felt quite daring at the time, because, of course, as an art historian, I had not really said I before. And now I come to your question, like, what is this I? And I think, first of all, one, of course, has to realize, and I think it's something many theoreticians of literature point to, as soon as the I is written on a page, it is an abstraction. It is someone else. The writer Deborah Levy once said this very well. She said that the I that we encounter in her books is someone who's definitely not her, but someone who knows her very well. And I like that, because it implies that this I, of course, kind of benefits from experiences of the writer and kind of works with them, but is not to be identified with the writer in a one-to-one fashion, even though there is a huge kind of tendency to do so when you read books where an I occurs. And I think my model for On the Benefits of Friendship, which chooses a rather confessional kind of tone of voice, was, among many others, Rousseau. Because when I read Rousseau's Confessions, I realized, oh my God, he himself acknowledges that these confessions are extremely stylized and constructed. They have an effect of, you know, confessing the authentic inner self of the author, but this is something that the author deliberately produced with the help of literary means. And I was very interested in that. And the fictional diary, what I liked about the form of the fictional diary, first of all, you know, I had many models for this, Max Frisch being one, a Swiss author who basically invented the diary as a form where cultural critique can happen as well, as a highly stylized form. So I was interested in that. And I was also interested in the fictionalized diary, because even though it's fictional and the dates in the books are not the real dates when things were written, there's still a sense of a historical trace running through it. It was written, and this is made clear in the book, during the pandemic. And I think that the pandemic was really the time where I realized, I mean, in a way, I've always been interested in friendships. I've been interested in friendships as the kind of motor of artistic production. How, if you study the history of the Western avant-gardes, you realize that all these art movements were always based on formations that consisted of artists who had friendships with one another. Friendships which were both marked by sympathy and competition. So this is something which is not new, and it's something that is important, I think, to realize that artists are not these kind of lonely beings falling from the sky, but they are part of these social formations, often organized via the modus of friendship. So this is something I was always interested in as an art historian. And then during the pandemic, something else happened. I realized, because during the pandemic we were all online more than ever, and I realized how former friends tended to treat each other so badly online, how there was a tendency to kind of mob each other. It was incredibly competitive because the cake was getting smaller and everybody realized, oh my God, where do I end up? So things were getting very rough on Facebook and on Instagram, where people really started to kind of betray each other, insult each other, because they could be more or less sure that they wouldn't have to encounter each other in real life. At the same time, the pandemic was a time where friends needed each other more than ever, where I forgave friends. I was very ready to forgive former irritations to my friends, because now we were all exposed to this crisis. So we started to call each other, we started to have walks together. I did a lot to be able to see my friends. I remember walks in the Berlin Tiergarten. It was ice cold. There was no opportunity to go to the toilet or to drink something, but we did it nevertheless because we needed to be with our friends, and their bodily, physical presence was so important for us. So it seemed that there was something going on, and I thought, okay, I think I have to write a book about friendships, about what it means. And you hinted to this, Liv, what it means if you find yourself in a situation where you are supposed to cooperate with your friends, who are your competitors at the same time. This is, for instance, one situation I'm very interested in. Like, what does that mean? In the art world, there is a tendency that everybody interacts with one another in this kind of friendship mode. But then it's highly competitive, as we all know, and very hierarchical. So what kind of difficulties result from this? What is the dark flip side of this friendly interactions? So in a way, I think, and this is my last point, I think one of the ideas for the book was also, okay, love has been demystified, if not by Tinder, or by sociologists such as Eva Illouz, who have famously argued and also demonstrated how romantic love is implicated in rights of consumption and is kind of part of an economics. So love, romantic love, is demystified. Friendship, not. Friendship seems to be this thing people hold on to, especially in times where the social state is progressively broken down, where it doesn't provide the social services it used to provide, where all of a sudden we count on our friends when we get older or when we get sick. So friendship seems to be the last bastion that many people defend, and they defend it in this idealistic fashion. And I completely understand that. And I'm also very attached to the notion of friendship, but I wanted to also demystify it at the same time. So that was the idea.
Yeah, and we'll get more into these difficulties and also what you say about the role of social media, and also especially in terms of in relation to the pandemic. But I mean, the art world as such is quite a broad term. So I wanted to ask if you could speak a bit about the different kind of art world contexts that you've been a part of throughout your career. You do write quite a lot about the arts community in Cologne, for example, in the late 1980s and 90s, and we also have a picture here from that time. And there you describe this scene as being quite male-dominated, harsh, and that there's a lot of division and betrayal. And so maybe you could speak both about Cologne and maybe also other contexts of the art world that you've experienced.
Yeah, it's funny, Liv, because the book was read a lot as a kind of reportage-like rendition of the Cologne art scene, even though the Cologne part in the book is, I think, 3 pages long. So, which shows you how
it sticks.
Yeah, and also how strong the Cologne, or the fascination for Cologne as a former center of a former Western European art market still is. I think the book starts with the protagonist explaining how she comes from a dysfunctional family and longs for like-minded friends who finally will understand her and where she will feel at home, and imagines this group of like-minded friends as something that will happen to her and that will provide, you know, a kind of less dysfunctional social environment for her than her original family. And I think I'm not alone in kind of providing this kind of description. I mean, the art world traditionally is a kind of attracts a lot of people from rather difficult or dysfunctional backgrounds. And so then the protagonist arrives in Cologne in the late 80s and is absolutely ecstatic about what she finds there in artists who have a kind of political agenda, theorists and critics who share her aesthetic and political viewpoints, a very animated scene where discussions take place, you know, every night in the bar. So there's this final, you know, belonging to a scene of like-minded friends with whom a common struggle for a certain aesthetic ideal takes place. But then there's also the slow realization that this scene consisting of friends and colleagues is even more dysfunctional than the original family, because it consists not only of a high degree of competition, but it's also very exclusive, it's also very sexist, and there are scenes described in the book that illustrate that point. It is a scene that devalues the labor of its female members, and anyhow there are very few of them who are accepted as belonging to this crowd. And it's also a scene where loyalty is nothing that can be expected in the long run, where a lot of betrayal happens. So there comes this realization that the Cologne art world, you know, even though it's paradise in certain respects, it's also hell. And I think this a bit sets the tone for what comes. I'm always interested in both in the potential of a formation and in its dark flip side. I think that you know, in the book, a lot of art scenes that I actually belonged to are skipped. I mean, I started out when I studied in Paris with the Parisian art scene, and after Cologne in 1999, I moved to Berlin, and this was the time where this former retail trade art scene that was rather European and more and smaller and local transformed itself into what I called in my book High Price as a global visual art industry. That became very corporate. So this shift happened in the late 90s when I moved to Berlin. So I think that the art world that I encountered in Berlin had very little to do with this substitute family type formation that I had encountered in Cologne.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, this Cologne idealization is also, we were speaking a bit earlier about a previous talk you gave with Lynn Tillman, where, because in the book you write about having written a book on Cologne that was titled The Dark Times.
The Dark Years.
The Dark Years, sorry, yes.
Die dunklen Jahre. It's better in German.
Yeah. And that she was quite surprised all of a sudden to realize that that's not a real book, actually, which I also think, is quite telling for your book, that it has this you're getting drawn into these worlds that are also, similar. You could have written that book.
Well, it's, The Dark Years is also a book that I'm planning to write. Yeah. The Dark Years, Cologne, 1988 to 1999. Could be fun. But it's funny because also even my editor, when he came to visit to my house for tea, he was like, "Where's the dog?" And so there is this, truth effect of this kind of auto-fictional writing. It makes people believe that things are like that. It was interesting that Lynn Tillman, who's herself a writer, she was very disappointed that not everything that is written here is the truth. Because, all the protagonists, I wanted to protect my friends. I didn't want to, kind of hurt anybody. And I didn't want to, that's a complicated thing, and maybe I will read something about that, this whole subject of writing about friendships that are useful and using my friendships for the book, which is, of course, the constitutive paradox of this whole endeavor. There was no other way around it, but in order to protect my friends, in order to not hurt them, in order to not turn this book into a roman à clé where everybody would just look for the people and who's who, I decided that each protagonist is a kind of hybrid of many. All the genders are switched and the names are, of course, fictional, and it's not about particular persons. Of course, my closest friends read this book in search of, maybe I'm in it. Oh my God, I hope I'm not.
But this I found quite interesting. Also, a passage in the book where the I character writes about having shown a friend a passage, and this friend recognizing themselves, but it wasn't actually that friend that the I was writing about.
Yeah, this happened often. Also, even after the book was published, I had one friend who was very angry because she thought she wasn't in the book, even though she is. And the other friend was even more upset and wanted me to write her out because she thought she had recognized herself and she wanted me to get her out. So, and then there was another one who thought that he did something that someone in the book does, which he never did. I mean, it was very interesting. It triggered very interesting interaction between my friends and me. I mean, with some friends it became a bit tense and difficult. With others it became weirdly open because the I in the book is also seemingly extremely honest and really tries to say the truth. So this kind of encouraged many of my friends to tell me things they would never tell me usually, so it was also a bit much. So it's very interesting, the effect this book had. But all in all, I think that my good friendship got intensified in a good way. Some friendships stopped, and other relationships, it became just clear, these are not friends, but colleagues, dear colleagues of mine, but certainly no friends.
I think that one of the things that I find most striking about this book and most interesting is the way that the I character, the honesty in which the I character kind of writes about herself, in the sense that she reveals quite painful and at times, unsympathetic and uncharming sides to the self. And I think that this, positioning as not in any way morally superior gives the more credibility to the more theoretical criticism you also bring in. And I was wondering, we spoke about a passage that I would like to ask you if you could read on where the I kind of...
Which page?
25.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just one word before I read. this honesty, this kind of seeming, self-exposure is, of course, a literary effect again. It's not that I show myself how I really am. But I think it was important to me, I wanted to write a book on friendship, on a type of friendship that is both a utility friendship, as Aristotle called it, and based on true feelings and sympathy. And whereas for Aristotle, the utility friendship is bad and the absolute opposite of the true friendship, I wanted to demonstrate how these two types of friendships overlap and how you cannot make a clear distinction between them. How it can be the case that you really like someone, but you also want something from them. And this, of course, leads to complications that I was interested in. And I wanted to also not appear, I didn't want the protagonist to be in any way, as you say, superior or better. I didn't want the protagonist to sound like, oh, I'm the good friend and everybody else is just cultivating instrumental friendship, but I'm, of course, the better one. No, I wanted to introduce a protagonist who also, wants to meet a person because not only she thinks this is an interesting and nice person, but also the work of this person is interesting to me, and maybe the contact to this person could be of use to me. And this is something the protagonist, this kind of calculating kind of thoughts, are something that is not foreign to the protagonist. And therefore I wanted the protagonist to be not necessarily always sympathetic, but also, yes, also guilty from time to time of feeling aggressive or feeling jealous. So that was, kind of dealing with envy toward a friend who reports from all her successes. Like, how do you deal with that? You meet a friend and they have a monologue about their constant successes and you feel like you've done nothing. And of course you feel very envious. And to kind of allow for this was important to me, and not to shy away from negative feelings. And the theorist that has encouraged me to do so is Melanie Klein, because Melanie Klein is one of the psychoanalysts who focused on aggression and the role aggression plays in our, she calls them object relations, in our relations to others. Aggressions do play a role, and I think it's better to deal with that than to pretend that one is endlessly good and harmless and has never had any aggressions. So I wanted to cultivate this kind of voice that allows for that. So that was a bit long. So at some point, generally in their 50s, even those who have long resisted market success tend to do all they can to earn more money and avoid slipping into poverty in their later years. Most of my friends do aspire to a good life with comfortable living conditions and regular vacations. But to realize such a lifestyle has become increasingly expensive, meaning complaints about high living costs, low rates of pay, self-exploitation, and a lack of institutional recognition are commonplace in conversations with my closer art world friends. Some tend to see their lives as only ever drawing a negative balance, blaming their situations on everyone but themselves. As well informed as I may be about the structural dimensions of their failures, and my own, I sometimes catch myself thinking that they might also have contributed to their own misery. And the more space I give to this thought, the less inclined I am to help these friends when they fall into difficulties, not just emotionally, but by supporting them financially, for example. So this is basically about, I'm theoretically aware about the fact that individual failure is conditioned by social structures. I'm aware of that. I do not I do not believe in the neoliberal notion of self-responsibility, that each is self-responsible for their fate. But faced with these friends who complain over years and years about their situation and always blame others and never question their own contribution to this, I catch myself thinking, didn't they also cause this in some way? And I realize how I become less inclined to help them. So that's basically what this is about. So it's, it's not necessarily sympathetic.
But I mean, I think it's very recognizable also, I mean, in terms of how we're all drawn into these kind of neoliberal ways of thinking as well. It's kind of inevitable in many ways, no matter where your values lie, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's also, I mean, one red thread that runs through the book is psychoanalysis. And I think that, you know, in there is a tension between the neoliberal kind of focus on individual responsibility and its denial of social structural factors. That's one thing, but then there's psychoanalysis that acknowledges, you know, the kind of structural dimension of one's crisis, but focuses on agency and enabling one to somehow negotiate one's conditions differently. So I guess that this is also one of the reasons why I mean, the protagonist in a way also seems to say something like get therapy to her friends instead of complaining about the same thing for 15 years.
Yeah, and you mentioned Aristotle, who's a reference that you use in your book from quite early on, this notion of utility friendship and true friendship, but you also reference a lot of other thinkers, I mean, from Nietzsche and, as you mentioned, Melanie Klein, Hannah Arendt, and I wondered if you could speak a bit about this kind of mapping of theoretical and philosophical thinking around friendship, and the role that has in your book.
Yeah, I think what I wanted to inform myself about theories on friendship in philosophy, sociology, art history. I was very interested in reading up as much as I could, but I didn't want to write a kind of cultural critique of friendship. I wanted to write a literary, experimental, fictionalized diary that makes these thoughts productive. And it was actually, you know, so I tried to get an overview starting with Aristoteles, then, you know, looking at Krakauer, looking at also Hannah Arendt, and especially Hannah Arendt's letter exchange with Mary McCarthy, looking at Derrida's The Politics of Friendship, of course, and many sociologists also have looked at friendship recently, but I tried to, first of all, weave their propositions into the book in a way that made sure that the book doesn't become a theory book. And I also, instead of using the thoughts of these thinkers as a kind of decoration quote, which is often what happens, I wanted to work with these thoughts and also possibly contradict them or expand on them and really maybe come to a different conclusion. You know, for instance, when Derrida, for instance, I mean, first of all, when he talks about friendship, his idea of friendship is always gendered. He only thinks about male friends. The great friends in Derrida's book are all male. So that's already a problem, right? And then he also, he has one very interesting proposition, which is in a way very psychoanalytical and also deconstructivist. He proposes that friendship is based on misrecognition. You can only be friends if you misrecognize one another, if you don't really see one another. So I think that's, of course, a very interesting thought that goes against the idea of transparency, that goes against the idea of a deep kind of deep Seelenverwandtschaft, a kind of affinity of the souls, which is how Montaigne describes friendship, a kind of fusion of souls. Derrida says exactly the opposite. He says, we misrecognize our friends. So I thought that was a very, very helpful proposition. But then also he basically goes against Aristoteles, who always insisted on friendship being something exclusive. He insisted on friendship being something that you can only have with very few people, whereas Derrida argues for the many friends, and from then on argues for his concept of hospitality. And then I was thinking, okay, I think I'm going with Aristoteles here, because considering that we live in this digital economy, where, for instance, in social media, we have an inflation of so-called friends. Think of Facebook and the, fake friends we are supposedly having there. Considering that friendship has become such an elastic concept, I go with the exclusivity of friendship that Aristoteles proposes. So what I'm trying to say is I use their thoughts, but to do something with them, to weave them into my proposition so that it doesn't sound like a theory book on friendship, but it's more using these authors to come to terms with all the difficulties that the topic posed to me.
Yeah, and as you mentioned Derrida and his focus on male friendship, I wanted to ask you about female friendship, and maybe this would be a good time to also speak about this image that you told me some interesting things about earlier, because this looks like a quite strong gang.
Yeah, first of all, I think in the book, the one female friendship that gets most space is the one between Hannah Arendt and Mary McCarthy. And I was in particular interested in their letter exchange, and it's very moving. This happened like in the 50s mostly, and also 60s, and they were really supporting each other. I mean, of course, they were no competitors in the strict sense of the term, because Arendt was a philosopher and Mary McCarthy was an author. But for instance, when Hannah Arendt got a shitstorm because of her Eichmann book, as we would say today, Mary McCarthy immediately wrote an article and published it in defense of Arendt, and vice versa. When Mary McCarthy published her book, The Group, which was mocked by Norman Mailer in the most sexist way, Hannah Arendt went ahead and published an essay in defense of Mary McCarthy's The Group. And when I read that, I was like wondering, okay, is this ever happening nowadays? Could I, if my work gets dissed, and maybe for wrong reasons, is there any friend who would kind of immediately publish something in my defense? And then I made a private statistics among my friends and colleagues. I was like, do you expect your friends to kind of defend your work once it gets attacked? And they all said, no. Maybe, if I'm lucky, someone will call me and tell me that this is very tough, but nobody will stand up for me in public. And then I have a whole reflection in the book about why that is. In what way this reflects that we are living in different times where this type of solidarity cannot be expected, is not even expected anymore. And of course, I'm a little bit nostalgic about, Arendt and McCarthy. I would love to have a friend like that in my defense, but I also understand the reasons as to why, then I have a whole passage in the book where it's about this observation that I have been also sharing with many of my friends, that it's often your friends or fake friends who rejoice mostly, who are very happy about your failures. And it's a very interesting phenomenon, and therefore also, because there is this highly competitive dimension, they would never come to your defense. Then it might also be that they think that the review that this is your work is right, or that this is something you deserve because you anyhow, why do you publish all the time? So we're living in a very different cultural environment than also Arendt and McCarthy, of course, were each exceptional woman in their particular social scenes. And their solidarity was also one of the few exceptional women who were actually, having a public persona, who were publishing and who were both quite successful. Anyway, in this picture, yes, it's a picture that Hans-Jörg Meyer, the painter, took in 1991. It was his idea to kind of present this group of young women as guerrilla fighters and put guns into their hands. So it is a kind of a male fantasy enacted here of the castrating powerful women. But, and I remember when originally the photograph was supposed to be the model for a painting that should have followed, but I think he never did it. And this photograph was, when it was produced, immediately bought by Martin Kippenberger and other artists at the time who used it as a pin-up poster in their bedroom. But what is interesting about this picture for me, and here maybe I project, and you can kind of really tell me wrong if you don't agree with my reading, but this picture has been read, especially in the US, as a terrific example of female solidarity and a powerful women's group in Cologne, and many young female artists have identified with this and used it as a model, and there was a lot of kind of fascination coming from this image because the artists that you see here are all quite known. Charlene von Heil, she's actually called, my assistant wrote her name wrong, Michaela Eichwald, she's the one here, then Jutta Köter, the painter, Cosima von Polin, the artist, and I'm the kind of critic theorist. And I think if you look at this image and its iconography more carefully, there is no group. And there is also no connection. It's individual, singular fighters who fight for themselves, but are not necessarily, in touch with each other or having some sort of common or communality. They each is like pretty much for themselves. There is no visible interaction. And this actually, for me, describes a situation where, while we were interested in each other's works and also occasionally supported each other, there was no sense of, of a woman's group that cultivates female solidarity. It was more like how Joe Freeman described it, the dark side of sisterhood. There was a lot of competition, and each was for herself at the end of the day. And I kind of think, and again, maybe this is my crazy retroactive kind of pessimistic reading, but I think that this is not a kind of cohesive guerrilla group, but it's more all these lonely fighters put next to each other, each having her own goal and fixating it, and not really having so much in common. But you can tell me wrong.
I like your analysis of it. Each on their own. There is also this passage that I'd like to ask you if you could read, where the protagonist gets a very negative review of her new book by a friend that I think is quite a good example of situations that, I think the feelings that arise from that is quite taboo to speak about in our field.
It's the date is here again. It's a fictional diary. 23rd October 2020. My life has come to resemble a Shakespearean drama in recent days. Damning reviews of my newly published book, The Dark Years, Cologne 1980-80, 1990-19, have been authored by friends of mine. While I knew they would write about my book, I assumed they would show me their reviews in advance and maybe even discuss them with me before writing them. Instead, I now stumble across them, leaving me feeling as if I've been punched in the gut. While their words affect me, I also feel both guilty and outcast from their community. My book was evidently a serious and irreparable mistake on my part, for which I now seem to be punished with excommunication. I actually found some of their criticisms reasonable. They complain that I fixate on the scene's male protagonists, that I demystify this social universe instead of depicting it as a space of possibility, and that I sacrifice the political concerns of those involved by commodifying them and giving them over to the mainstream. While these objections should be taken seriously, I can't escape the impression that in tearing my book to shreds, the authors also sought, unconsciously I hope, to damage me personally. After all, their reviews signaled their desire to distance themselves from me and my work. In a field governed by the laws of celebrity culture, it is impossible to separate these two things, that is, the product and the person behind it. Even the most objective criticism is taken as a personal attack. This is compounded by the fact that the tone of their reviews sounds self-righteous to my ears, as if they know something I've failed to grasp entirely. Their verdict seems to be, she's lost the plot. Why were they not more hesitant in their criticisms, instead of rejecting my book outright? For all its questionable aspects, which I too now recognize, might it not also contain some arguments that are worth considering and maybe even defending?
Thank you. Yeah, some of these feelings, I'm sure a lot of people would prefer to be left unknown when they have them. And the I in the book certainly also reflects on the fact that maybe some of this, maybe this shouldn't be published, or how it will be received. And I wondered if you could say something about whether you yourself found it risky to publish this book.
Yeah. First of all, also when reading this now, I mean, I definitely, when writing this, put always 4 gears up. I mean, it's supposed to create this rather intense sound that pulls you in, and it's really a bit over the top on purpose. I mean, the first half of the book is also having the headline "Lament," and the second part is having the headline "Hymn," because it's a kind of a hymn on friendship. So that already indicates that things are a bit like, you know, yeah, they are exaggerated. But when it comes to my fears regarding the publication of this book, they were actually quite intense, to be honest. First of all, I have never rewritten a book so often. And I also had 2 trusted friends to whom I gave the book, wondering whether I could risk publishing it, because I know that they have my protection in mind. And one of them was like, I'm not sure, I think you should really wait. And then I had a whole phase where I thought, okay, I will publish this book posthumously after my death. And which seemed kind of less nerve-wracking, because I know about, you know, especially the shitstorm possibilities online, and then I also didn't want to alienate all my friends, and it felt very daring. But then my daughter, who's 17 now, she refused to take care of this posthumously. She was like, no way, you know, you wrote this, Mom, so deal with it now, you know. And so I decided, okay, maybe I have to rewrite it one last time to make things a bit more mediated and less direct and more literary. And then at some point, I decided, after many, many sleepless nights and a conversation with an artist friend, and this artist told me, Isabelle, if you have so much fear and if you don't sleep, this means this is worth it. There's something really going on here. And I was like, yeah, I can only hope you're right, because it might also be the opposite, that I'm totally having good reasons for not wanting to publish this. But yeah, then at some point it took a life of its own, and I started writing other things, and then, you know, the people from the publisher really liked it, and then it became a bit removed from me in a way. When other people start reading and corrected it, then it's also a bit like not yours anymore. And once it got published, I of course was also nervous. But I guess it's always when you expect the worst, then things like that don't happen. Actually, nothing much happened. You know, maybe people don't tell me, but it was actually quite well received, and nobody broke up with me, and now I'm very happy. I'm very happy I did it. But it was a very, I think it was the most difficult book for me to write so far, because it was so close to my social universe, and I didn't also want it to sound like I'm betraying, I'm betraying my friends. And maybe I should read this short passage about the main difficulty. Where was it again? Which page? You know, I mean the one with the fear of the reactions. I think it's possibly, quickly. The more progress I make with this book, the more I worry about how my friends and former friends will react when the book comes out. How will they feel about me drawing upon my relationships with them, even if in fictionalized form? The thought that it might cause a minor shitstorm fills me with anxiety. The tension I feel when I picture the potential negative reactions of my friends leaves me unable to write any further. I'm unfit to work. The tension fills me to my core, physically manifesting itself as a painful pressure in my lower back, and I sit at my desk as if paralyzed. I feel a rush of regret rising within me in such moments, a sense of shame that I'm using my friends and my experience with them for this project. Is it not downright perfidious of me to write a book on the instrumental nature of art world friendships, while at the same time doing that very thing myself, using my friendships as material for the book? Or is there simply no getting around the contradiction that my critique of instrumental friendship also means exploiting both these relationships and other less useful friendships? This contradiction seems to be constitutive for the project. Its fictive aspects are interwoven with the personal, and foregoing references to my own experiences of friendship would diminish its power. After all, the thoughts it presents were triggered by events in my own life. It takes a specific viewpoint to breathe life into sociological observation. So the protagonist calms herself down by basically saying, you know, I needed to make use of this material, otherwise my observations on friendships would have been lifeless. They would have been without any spice, without any flesh. I had no other way than to tap into this kind of experiential dimension.
And I think I have one more question before we open up to the audience, which is also a specific kind of experience that you write about when it comes to the economical aspects of functioning as a professional in the art world. And of course, I mean, monetary value is of interest here because an artwork has the potential of reaching a very high price, but that's not the case for a lot of other types of labor, and also not labor that might contribute to these prices. And I wondered if you could speak a bit about this, for example, the value of writing and you know, being a critic, and also then I would also ask if you could read a passage where you write about the experience of artist friends becoming very successful.
Which page was this?
It's on page 14.
14? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, briefly, of course, I think this was also one of the motivations of the book, to kind of openly reflect on the consequences of these economic inequalities. Because, I mean, the protagonist, for instance, you know, is a critic, and realizes that she contributed to the production of symbolic value for many artists, some of which earn millions with their works, which is of course not her case. The critic does not participate in any way in this increase of monetary value that she contributes to on some level, at least in a small way, because I think criticism, you know, produces symbolic value, if only by saying this is worth our consideration. So, and of course there are many facets to this. On the one hand, there is the critic who plays the role of the poor relative among his or her successful artist friends, who themselves also don't really want to be reminded those days where they depended on the critic's support. So there's a weird kind of, how can I say, alienation to be observed often between successful artists and their former critic supporter friends. I mean, some successful artists are very loyal, and in the old days there were all these stories, you know, about artists gifting their critics a painting, and the critics is finally able to buy herself an apartment. This is really kind of not happening so much anymore nowadays. It's more something that we find in the 40s and 50s. These kind of exchanges are actually rarely, if never, taking place. What does happen, though, is that, of course, on the side of the critic or art historian who finds herself or himself, you know, without a private jet and without a holiday home and without even an own apartment, because her work is worth so much less, which also has to do with the concrete value form of art writing versus the material unique artwork. These are actually cultural productions with very, very different value forms. So there is this incredible injustice going on. And this, of course, has effects on the friendships and can make friendship relationships rather tense. These socioeconomic inequalities, everybody knows about them. It's an open secret. It's never really spoken about. There's also little attempts being made to compensate the critics or the art historians, because there'll always be others who will write the text for less. So, you know, if as a critic or art historian you decide, okay, I'll have higher fees then, that's all very well, but, you know, you'll always be competing with someone who will do the same thing for much less. So yes, so I try to describe this particular economy and its implications for friendship. And maybe quickly, reading this part here. There are some friends of mine whose work I have supported since the beginning of their careers, for which I was often rewarded with commissions for catalog texts or talks. In certain cases, these friendships were subsequently characterized by a sort of psychodynamic law, where an artist experienced institutional success that I myself had also contributed to, or at least played some part to. Only rarely was this acknowledged. I found it telling that their interest in me diminished at the exact moment the institutional recognition and market success they long desired was finally bestowed upon them. Possibly, I reminded them too strongly of a phase in their life when things were not going so well and they were more reliant on me, a dependency they now wanted to shed. Correspondingly, I also sought to free myself from a strong orientation toward their practice in my own work. While a few of these artists subsequently rose to a higher economic sphere, people like me, who originally helped pave the way to their success, remained at a lower level of the hierarchy. In financial terms, critics, in any case, occupy the role of the poor relative, since the fees they command are extremely low when compared to the incomes of the commercial, successful artists whose works they occasionally write about. While they can, in theory, continue to influence the careers of the artists in question, in reality, it is rare for critics to distance themselves from artist friends they formerly supported, since this would run the risk of devaluing their earlier engagement with them and damaging their own credibility, which is not in their interest. That being said, there are also artists who remain loyal to those critics and supporters who assisted them in their early careers. In exceptional cases, especially within the commercial art scene, a further phenomenon can be observed, that of successful artists gifting their critics a piece of art in return for their services, thus directly involving them in its potential for future returns. Should its value rise within the auction sphere, the critic will one day be able to sell it in order to, for instance, use the proceeds to buy an apartment. Scenarios such as this, which speak of a compensatory sense of fairness, can be found time and again throughout the history of the art market. Of course, a friend of mine said to me, you have to cancel this, artist friend of mine, because what about your tax consultant and your tax problems? Because this indicates that you have paintings at home that were gifted to you by artists and you probably didn't pay tax for them. You should cut this out. But luckily these kind of things, as I said before, they happen rarely. And in a way, I think there's more of a structural problem here, that the whole art economy basically is based. I mean, its benefits are conditioned by the exploitation of many of its members, not only critics and art historians, also
and many
art handlers, art assistants, many artists, many people who self-exploit themselves, who work more or less for free. The whole, I think one could even say, the budgets are calculated in such a way that this exploitation is calculated in.
Yeah.
On a sad note.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's see if there are any questions from the audience. Yes, Stefan.
I can start since I promised to
kick it off.
Kick it off. That's good.
Feel free to jump in. I think it's interesting that you put up this sociological analysis of friendship on the one hand, and then you contrast it to this like nostalgic view of the real friendship, and then what's going on often in the art world is superficial descriptions of it. Is this friendship mode, which has, you go into quite great lengths of describing like what are the effects of this, like to the economy or to making artists' career. And of course, in that system, like this real friendship is sometimes something that we're suspicious about. We had The past year we had a cultural minister in Norway that had to resign because of dealings with her friends. So it's like it can put you in a situation where you are like it's simply legislated against, which of course creates a worry. And there's this creeping in of the system into this friendship. But do you think there's anything to be said, or do you have any like reflections on the potentials of this like real friendship? Like, is there any way to counter the system from within the deep, authentic friendship?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I would I would not argue for the real versus the unreal friendship. I think that friendships are a muddled place, and I think we cannot. There's no way back to an imaginary purity. I think it's more interesting to acknowledge how interest and use overlap with sympathy, affection, support, loyalty, how these things cannot be clearly separated from one another. I think that's maybe more realistic. But I also wanted to say something about, or to reply to what you said in the beginning about friendship as the modus operandi in the art economy. There's a whole passage in the book where the protagonist thinks about why that is. Why do art actors pretend to be friends with everyone involved? And I think one of the reasons for this has to be located in the product that gets exchanged here, meaning artworks. Because artworks are commodities of a special kind. Artworks are supposed to be priceless and consist of this unmeasurable symbolic value, and this is a belief that we find at least since the 18th century. But at the same time, they have a price. So they are these, overdetermined, symbolically charged objects that are priceless and have a price at the same time, that are full of idealistic expectations and claims while also circulating as a commodity. But unlike other commodities, they have this symbolic value that is ascribed to them. And this peculiar art economy that cannot be reduced to its price needs a form of transaction that does justice to that. And this is friendship. I think the friendship modus mirrors that which is claimed for the artwork, that we cannot describe it sufficiently with its price. And I would even agree with that. So I think that, and also when you mentioned this kind of insider trading problem, of course the art economy, as we all know, is one of the last non-regulated, extremely non-transparent economies where these kind of friendship favor deals, one hand washes the other interactions happen all the time. And this, of course, leads to problems, but there is a potential here too. And I wonder if I would be so fascinated by the art economy if it would be regulated. I think one of the reasons why I'm so interested in this social universe is its kind of irregular kind of nature. The art economy is peculiar. I've described this in High Price because on the one hand, it consists of very archaic interactions. I think of these dinners after openings. But then it's also this highly corporate global world. So it's both. It has this kind of old school standing on the table after the dinner kind of thing going on. But then it's also really business. And that's something I'm also interested in analyzing.
And here I would just also like to ask what you think kind of social media's role is also in the art economy.
Yeah, I mean, a friend of mine, Merlin Carpenter, a real friend, he wrote a text called Steam Engine, and in this text he describes, and I think rightly so, how Instagram basically took the place of the art world. That there is no art world anymore, it shifted to the online sphere. But he also said, and this is something that I think should make us pause before we post something maybe. He said, if you have a business on Instagram, you have no business. You know, pointing to how dependent we become on this very questionable platform enterprise. And but on the other hand, you know, I also must say that I totally understand every young artist who feels that she or he has to be on Instagram, otherwise, you know, she falls out of the spotlight. She doesn't exist. So there is, in a way, no way around it. But then there's also a lot of shortcomings that come with Instagram, and I've written about this in a text called "Welcome to the Resort," where I was looking at, you know, showrooms on Instagram or artists' representations on Instagram, realizing this doesn't tell me anything about what is at stake in artistic production, because what falls away here is the context. I don't know what these works are about, what gets negotiated here. I have no idea. So all this contextual expert knowledge vanishes in the online sphere. And so what replaces this is evaluations via likes. So a kind of qualitative expert judgment about what is at stake in a work gets replaced by quantitative like. And this is something I think not necessarily to be deplored. I just think one has to realize that things are really changing in that area.
Yeah. Other questions? Yes, Anna.
Yes, thank you very much. It's super interesting. I was thinking a bit about what you said of like the more formal artist groups or communities, you know, throughout 19th, 20th century. I just experienced by forming production collective for artists, like artist-owned film production company, how much more solidarity you suddenly felt, or I suddenly felt with my common fellows in this community. So I wonder if you have any thoughts around the difference between like these more coincidental friendships or like friendships with other artists and the friendships that are formed through a kind of formal communities.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Of course, again, I think the border between artistic formations that consists of friendships between artists and collectives are fluid. You know, many collectives look like a formation of artist friends, and vice versa. Many groups that consist of artist friends kind of look a bit like a collective and sometimes organize themselves also like a collective. But about the collective or collectivity as a point of fascination, I would like to refer to an issue of Texte zur Kunst that we published in 2021 called Collectivity, in reaction also to Documenta 15, which, as you all know, put the emphasis on collectivity. And we were interested in two things. We were interested in the potential and the potential of collectives and the fascination for collectives in times where we get progressively isolated from one another and individualized by the economy. So I think seen from that angle, and also considering that a social welfare state that deserves this name doesn't really exist anymore. And from this point of view, I think the collective has a lot of potential and understandable attraction. But I think one shouldn't forget, and this is what we argue in this issue, that collectives can also be hell. That collectives do not imply necessarily that hierarchies vanish. Collectives can also very often be practicing exclusion and inclusion. Power relations and conflicts, of course, do not disappear with a collective. So we looked at collectives again from a psychoanalytic point of view with someone like Bion and his famous book on groups, looked at the dark flip side of collectives while acknowledging its potential. And I think that would be for me the way to go. Not to think this is the solution now, because it comes with new problems that I think have to be addressed as well. And of course there's a long history with addressing these problems. And I think Joe Freeman's text, which you can find online, The Dark Side of Sisterhood, is a very helpful kind of window into this kind of complicated nature of the collective that is both very enabling and possibly limiting at the same time. It's not paradise, in my experience.
Any last question? Then I have one last question for you, which is what we actually started with. What should remain unsaid within friendships?
Yeah, if you put it like that, I feel like I wrote a how-to book, which I definitely didn't. I have no idea. I don't want to be prescriptive or normative in any way. I think it's just important, and the protagonist of the book says that many friendships can exist because certain things are not mentioned. And I think my book is not a call for transparency, and it's not an attempt to argue for a tell-it-all kind of approach toward friendship, where you constantly organize, in German we call it Stunden der Wahrheit, the hour of truth with your friend, and tell them what you really think about them and what you really are disturbed by. I mean, this is, of course, again, another kind of hell that I wouldn't advocate. But I think that the book, in the book there is a protagonist who kind of really, deals with a lot of problematic and hurtful behaviors of her friends and also of herself toward her friends. And there comes a moment where she draws a line when it has become too hurtful and painful. But there are other moments also where she enjoys the neurotic behavior of her friends because she herself is, of course, not free of neurosis. So I think it's, again, there is no rule, and there's no, I'm not the one to say, here's the moment where you really should kind of end the friendship. But I think the book, also needs for its climax, it needs this moment with Peter where the friendship ends and is also declared to be finished. And then there's all this pain that results from that is very similar from the pain you have when you lose a lover. There's actually no difference between these type of pains. I guess I'm not a consultant for how to conduct your friendships. I can only say that after my book, I can say that some of my friendships really intensified. Others turned out to be no friendships. And I also, since I was trying to, not be disappointed by expecting things from colleagues that I would expect from friends, and to realize they are colleagues and not friends was also very liberating. So I have very few friends, true friends now, and we do use each other occasionally. Also I have liberated myself from expecting friendship behavior from those who are not friends. And this was, on a personal level, a very liberating experience. And but I think everyone will negotiate their friendships in their own way. And one friend of mine said to me after reading the book, "But Isabelle, I think you should be more tolerant because we are all completely crazy." And I think he has a point. It's also and that's also the end. I think the last sentence of the book argues for, embracing also the deficits of your friendships and not having some abstract idea of what a friend should provide, and if she or he doesn't, that's it. No, I mean, it's also really important to embrace your friends with all their neuroses and defaults as much as you want to be accepted with all your crazy behavior. But there might come a point where things get unbearable, and then you might want to end it.
I think that's a nice way to end. We do not, unfortunately, have Isabelle's book physically available, but we have a discount code that you can use, that you can find in the minibar if you wish to purchase it on Sternberg's websites. Yeah. Thank you so much, Isabelle.
This is how it looks. Oh, it has. This is not Warhol. It's Elaine Sturtevant's flower, and I liked it because Warhol gave her the screens so that she could do the flowers with slightly different colors, and this was based on a kind of friendship exchange on the one hand, but of course these flowers are also, they're like bad flowers because it's all about competition. It's about Sturtevant wanting to be Warhol, claiming to be Warhol, appropriating Warhol allowing for it. So it has a lot of friendship tension is kind of latent in this image. I call it Les Fleurs du Mal, after Baudelaire, and this is what we will listen to now.
Yeah, and thank you all for coming.